Today, Ryan and I are going to preview for you Aventuria. This is the Chalices of Power, although there's going to be a lot more in the overall campaign. This is a new revised version of this game that came out years ago. It's from Ulysses Spiel, and there's a lot of fans out there. Those fans gave a lot of feedback on the game over the last several years. They've made lots of revisions to it. So what we have in front of us is sort of their new edition or new revised version of the game.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And if you've never heard of this game, it is set in the world of The Dark Eye, which might not be super well known to our American audiences, but it is incredibly well known outside of the US and its home country of Germany. This is an RPG that rivals Dungeons and Dragons even in popularity, and is technically the longest running living world.
Oh, really?
Of a setting that of all RPGs.
Outside the real world.
Yeah, outside of the real world.
Yeah.
So this is a adventure card game that is set in that world, and it does some really, what I would say, unique things, and actually feels really modern in its design, considering that this was one of the first adventure card games that actually released. But like David said, they have spent the past years getting feedback, play testing it, working on this new version that's more modern, more streamlined. They say easier to play, and hopefully that all translates into more fun at the table. But it is, like we said, like if you've never played an adventure card game, it does kind of feel like your typical card game or CCG or LCG mixed with like an entire RPG campaign, kind of.
Yeah, the gameplay is obviously quite different. The mechanisms are very different than these. But some games that you may have played that I think you'd also potentially want to consider this, something like the Lord of the Rings card game, Pathfinder Adventures, the card game, those sorts of things. So if you like those sorts of vibes, while this plays very differently, I'd say also this is probably more streamlined in terms of how it's presented and how it plays.
I would say so. And it also leans, I think, more into the RPG narrative aspect, because every single game is going to have a narrative. You're going on a number of adventures, and even what we have, the Chalices of Power, has a number of adventures within it. And then there are other storylines that are going to be available on this campaign that will each have a number of adventures. But we have an adventure set up for you, and everything kind of revolves around this board here, where you're going to be placing all of the different cards that make up the adventure. And when you're choosing an adventure, you're going to be reading an entry in the book. We've got a little campaign book here, and it kind of gives you some narrative flavor and then tells you how to set this up. There are a few important things that you're always going to be using, and one of those is this time scale card, which is going to tell you kind of what happens over the course of the scenario. You're going to have a number of time tokens, and each time one of those time tokens is removed, you're going to do whatever the card tells you to do. You're also going to have a number of adventure cards set up. Like, for example, we have this one card, this hero action, Where is the Horn? But as you take actions in the game, as you go through the narrative and down these diverging paths making choices, more adventure cards are going to come out.
Yeah, those adventure cards are going to be things like this, which is another action we can take that's sort of tied to the objective, or at least the current objective at hand. Some other ones might come out that feel almost more like effects of, okay, now you're going this route, well, you've got to be careful because of this, or this is going to happen. So those cards might have you taking tokens off, putting tokens on, but all of them basically accumulate to a point where once it triggers, then something happens.
Yeah, a lot of like this one, for example, that we start with ends up with a number of tokens, and our goal is to look for this horn. As we're doing other things in the game, we're spending some of our actions to make what's called a perception test to remove those tokens. So that's another big thing. If you've played RPGs, you know skill tests are a thing. That is definitely a thing in this game. But I do want to point out, if you're looking at the cards, if you're seeing some of these stats and everything, all the numbers look high, it's because you want to roll low. You want to roll under your stat, which might be a little maybe brain twisty for some people.
It's very twisty, and you said that that's like the Dark Eye system.
Yeah, you want to, because the numbers go up. As you level up, your skills get higher, and you want to roll under them, and a 1 is your natural, your critical success.
A 1 is good. And in some ways, even though that might take some getting used to, and everyone thinks like, oh, that's backwards, actually, when I started playing, it felt like, okay, that makes some sense, because as your skills go up, it just gives you more room below that skill.
Right, that's exactly what's happening here.
To roll well, which is interesting. And a lot of the things that'll happen, temporary buffs by playing cards and stuff like that will temporarily increase some of those skills so that on your next roll, it's a little bit better.
And all of that is kind of dictated by your character. You are playing as a character. You're leveling that character up over the course of the game. And I'll talk about that, but you're kind of leveling them up in a few different ways. But one way is the character cards themselves. They go up to 3 levels. You choose your character card. It's going to give you all of your stats. It's going to give you your basic attacks and actions and things like that that you can do. And it's going to give you access to cards. So there is a constructed deck building element to this game. You're going to be building a 30-card deck, and every character class is going to tell you kind of what kind of cards are allowed in your deck. We're using these pre-made decks that they suggest for us, that they gave us for the demo version, the quick start. So we're using these 30-card decks, but you're able to make your own. And as you play the game, you level up your character. Yes, you do kind of replace these cards with higher versions, but you're also adding new cards to the deck. So there are 3 different levels, and you're going to be pulling cards from those different levels to always have a 30-card deck. And this is how you're going to see some significant like growth in the game, because your cards are getting better as you draw from those better versions. And you might get to a point eventually where most of your deck is made up of your level 3 cards, which are your strongest cards, but it leads to a lot of ability to create different strategies, and you can kind of build your deck for the adventure that you're going on.
Yeah, and those cards too, I mean, you're going to see a lot of what you might expect, but some cards are going to be equipment. You play those equipment as one of the things you could do on your turn, and that equipment might stay out for a while because you've equipped it. There may be cards that you play that just do a thing, like basically more like skill cards. They're all action cards for on your turn to play as one of the things you can do, spending some of the endurance that you have.
Yeah, and this is a really cool, I would say a really cool system that they've introduced. And actually, this kind of predates some other games that use similar systems.
Pioneered this for sure.
But everything in this game, you have endurance, and everything is kind of powered by this endurance, and you're spending this endurance. And this is where I think the game feels more like a TCG, CCG kind of game, because you're drawing your hand, and you're going to have a hand of cards to play. Every card has an endurance cost, so think of it like mana in Magic or resources in Star Wars. On the beginning of your turn, this might sound familiar, but you're drawing 2 cards into your hand, and then you get to place 2 cards down into your resource pool.
Up to 2.
Up to 2, which feels like very modern. I mean, we've seen games like Star Wars Unlimited and Lorcana kind of adapt this way of like generating endurance or mana. It's very cool to see that kind of card system in a big adventure card game like that. And then you're playing cards from your hand, like David said, by spending this endurance. And these cards are going to do most of what you're doing in the game. Yes, there's going to be combat we'll talk about in a second. You're equipping these, you're going to be using them. Some of the cards that you've played will cost endurance. Some of your actions that are printed on your cards cost endurance. So the real gameplay here, it really does feel inspired by CCGs.
Yeah, for sure. That part of it in particularly feels like that. But of course, it is a cooperative game where we're going on an adventure. Yep. We're going to be fighting alongside each other. So unlike TCGs,
that's true.
I find that appealing personally.
Yeah, you get to use, and it's like that. If you love that kind of gameplay, but don't love the direct PvP like this is a great version of that.
Exactly.
So a lot of what you're doing is to make your character better, not just for the challenges and the combat, but also for the skill checks, because a lot of what you're doing in this game, as you read through the narrative, so like for example, we have the campaign book here, and it kind of talks you through some narrative, and I'm not going to read it all.
No spoilers.
No spoilers.
It should be said, too, this is a prototype that we're using, so we have, like, the content they gave us, I think they said represents 10% of the entire game, and what we played is even a smaller portion of that still.
So, for example, as this example happens, we're chasing some villains. The villains have safeguarded their escape route with treacherous traps. So the first thing we do in this entire game is try to avoid the traps by making a survival check. So
straight off the bat.
Straight off the bat. So each person looks at their survival. My survival's 8. I want to roll less than 8, and I roll a 9, so absolutely failed.
I rolled a 15, which is also higher than mine.
So we both failed. Yes. So it will tell you, there's a whole chart. It says, okay, if you fail, you lose 2 life points. Hey, if we had made a critical failure, which is rolling a 20, get that, you would fall in the pit and lose 5 health. So we'd lose 2 health on this wheel.
Right? That's
each player. Yeah. So we take our dial down. So that's just like a quick example of how that works. A lot of times it's going to rely on the die roll, but sometimes not. Sometimes it's going to rely on fate, and that's what we have this deck of fate cards here, because sometimes you'll make a decision and it says we're leaving it up to fate. You give these a shuffle, you draw one, and like, oh, this is misfortune. So I'd look at the book and I would do whatever misfortune says. By the way, there's also like a great misfortune, but there's also a great success. So you have, some options in this deck.
What's interesting about that is that it's kind of, there's a discard pile. Yeah. So you'll see the cards as they're discarded. So you kind of have a little better sense of like, well, we've had all the great misfortune already, so it's got to be at least one of these two things.
Right, exactly. So you're playing through the narrative like that. Every scenario, every adventure that you set up, once you set it up here, you're playing through that, and that's going to tell you how to set up everything on this mat. So we'll follow some of the rules that are on the timescale card. We'll see if there's any rules on the adventure cards that are placed out, and then mainly you're following the rules of the adventure. You're going through until you make these branching paths, and I'll tell you, a lot of things can happen from these branching paths. You'll be adding out those adventure cards like David mentioned. You might be gaining some reward cards, which you see over here. There are some disadvantage cards that can be mixed in. You can earn some leader actions, which are these cards right here. You can add a leader action, which gives you an action that anybody can take during a particular game. And then you have a deck of henchman cards. And while this deck is made up of very specific cards, so the scenario will tell you if you're playing this adventure, add together these 7 cards. And then we'll be getting to his point in combat. In our version, we had to make a decision early where we had to decide if we were going to make noise or not. And we made noise. You add some tokens to a card. And then when you get to the end, you're going to have 1 henchman appear for every noise token that you've placed. So that's one way that you're going to be interacting with the adventure cards. A lot of what you're doing, though, it is all going to culminate in that combat. Our combat at the start was just kind of against these henchmen.
Yeah, some of the later scenarios might be different. This one that we played definitely led, depending on the decisions you made, you might get there in a different way.
Sure.
Some different results towards the end, but we did lead up to one sort of boss fight. And I will tell you this too, even though these 2 henchmen came out because we made 2 noise, it's also limited to player count, but that doesn't really mean anything because in this case, all the henchmen kept coming out too. So it was effectively, at that point, a game of fighting these off, trying to also make some progress on this card at the same time, and seeing which one was going to happen first.
Yeah, and that was very specific to this scenario. We had to find this drinking horn, and our time scale says every time we remove one of these, more enemies would come out. And so we're fighting off these enemies, and you can't let them build up, so you do need to focus on fighting your enemies. But also, we had to do this, which was spend an endurance to make a perception test. If you succeed, you get to remove these tokens, and when you remove all of the tokens, then we actually did have a boss come out, and that boss card comes down here. So now we're fighting this ogre and all of the henchmen. We have a certain number of time to do that before we lose. So all that's getting balanced. Like you're having to decide, okay, now how do we have to deal with the henchmen, but we ultimately have to kill the ogre to win.
Yeah, and the fighting is actually probably one of the more streamlined functions. This involves some dice rolling, but also a lot of what you can do with your actions doesn't. So you have a laundry list of things that you can do. When the enemies activate, they are often dictated by, if this activates, the Goblin Warrior, we roll a 12, we look at this chart here, and that's going to fall into this, and he does an attack. So it's kind of a dice-driven options of not AI, but a group of actions that they can take on
a very
their turn.
light AI, because if you haven't noticed, this is 100% card. So like some of the stuff you might expect to see, like positioning and movement and grid, all that's gone. It's all done by the cards, and all of the combat is done by the cards. And we won't go into this too much because if you've played an RPG, if you've played an adventure card game, you kind of get it. But the twist here is spending that endurance. It limits how much you can do. Every action, every card has an endurance cost, but you're playing items, you're playing action cards, you're making attacks, you're rolling dice, you've got armor, you've got dodge abilities,
looking for a horn.
Yeah, you've got looking for the horn. So all this stuff you can kind of do, and as you kind of build out your tableau, a lot of these cards will stay in front of you. Like I could play this longsword out, and this gives me an attack that I can use that's better than my basic attack, or you could get some equipment that gives you some defense, and you're doing all of that to try to survive. You start with 40 HP, but that might seem like a lot, but you're in a gauntlet. Like you're fighting your way through a gauntlet here. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I would say this part for me is what makes it most interesting. Having that endurance pool, having to decide like, ooh, I really like this card, but I really need the endurance, so I'm going to put it face down and hope I get my killer card later. It's a cool decision to make.
Yeah, like we said earlier, and I may be wrong. There may have been other games like this, but that feeling of those mechanics that are very relevant to the TCG world, I've never seen that kind of gameplay so, foot forward in a game like this where we're playing cooperatively, and on your turn, you're just doing what you can, and then the next player goes, and then the enemies go after that.
Yeah, it really feels like a TCG. I mean, I can't stress that enough. Yeah. Like all this other stuff, no, but when you're dialing in and it's your turn and you're looking at your hand, you're like, oh, I'm tapping my endurance here. I'm playing these cards. Like that is a a really satisfying feeling. So if you are a TCG gamer, and for example, I'm a big Marvel Champions fan. What I've always said about Marvel Champions, I wish there was more story attached to it.
Yeah.
And this definitely kind of gives you, I think, the best of both worlds combined.
Yeah, the story that this injects in these types of games, I really appreciate, because when you're going through that book, it definitely does feel kind of like a choose your own adventure where you're doing the things that happen in the book, oftentimes out here with the card play and some of the combat sequences and things like that, some of the things you're trying to do. And like we said, there's a lot of spaces for adventure cards here. I mean, some of these can probably get kind of wild where there's multiple things going on. You're probably having to juggle quite a bit going on here. Otherwise, they wouldn't have, 9 different adventure card spaces?
Right, and so many different henchman spaces. And so there is a ton of content. Definitely take a look at the campaign page because, like I said, we have the Chalices of Power, and we only have a demo of the Chalices of Power. There's other boxes.
There's a solo box.
There's a solo box that introduces a fully solo mode. There's other character boxes you can get. And they even said that some of those character boxes come with bonus adventures that can be played inside other campaigns. So a ton of different content available if you take a look at their page.
Yeah, take a look at their page, but if you have any questions at all, please make them in the comments below too. We'll try to get down there and answer whatever we can. Until next time though, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.